The greatest swordsman who ever lived did not believe in his own victories. Miyamoto Musashi set the record down himself in his own handwriting near the end of his life, and on the page it reads like a boast. 60 fights, the first of them when he was 13 years old, and not one defeat in any of them. Then, a few lines further down that same page, he took it back. The winning had probably not been skill at all, he wrote. Natural ability, maybe, or the order of heaven, or simply that the men he had faced were not very good. Nobody made him say that. He was 60 years old, he was ill, he was living alone in a cave on the western slope of a dead volcano in the south of Japan, and he had no readers to impress and no reputation left to defend. He looked back at the most extraordinary fighting record his country had ever produced, and he decided it did not prove anything. 400 years later, he is probably the most famous swordsman who has ever lived, and almost nothing about him can be confirmed. Historians still disagree about the year he was born and about which province he was born in. Nobody can say with confidence which side he fought on in the great battle of his age, and there is a serious argument that he was never at that battle at all. The man he is most remembered for killing may not have been called what everyone calls him. What survives, more or less unchallenged, is a small handful of documents in his own hand, a few ink paintings, and a book he finished a few weeks before he died, which people are still reading today, very often for reasons that would have puzzled him considerably. Here is the thing that gets left out. He was 28 or 29 when the fighting stopped. He lived another 32 years and never fought a famous duel again, which means that everything the world remembers about this man was over before he was 30, and that he spent the whole second half of his life turning it over, trying to work out what he had actually been doing when he was doing it. He studied morning and evening, he said, searching for the principle. He was 50 before he believed he had found it. What he did with those years is stranger still. He took up a brush. The boy who had beaten a grown professional to death with a length of wood became an old man painting small birds on mostly empty paper, carving figures out of wood, working ink across silk, and insisting to anyone who asked him that this was not a retirement from the sword, but the identical discipline carried on with different materials. The same thing exactly, no difference at all. He never married. One historian, trying to sum the whole life up in a sentence, wrote that Musashi never took a wife, never cut his hair, and never entered a bath. He died sitting upright with his sword in his left hand. So that is the question we have in front of us tonight, and I should tell you honestly that I have not settled it. What did he think he had been missing in all those years he was winning? Everything this hard, solitary, relentlessly practical mind ever worked out is here. The whole of it, including the question he was still holding when he died, and the one place, right at the end, where his own argument seems to come apart in his hands. None of it needs deciding now. You are lying down, it is late, and the dark has a way of taking the urgency out of things that feel heavy in daylight. There is nothing here to solve and nowhere you need to get to. If you drift off partway through a Japanese winter 400 years ago, that is a perfectly reasonable way to spend a night, and you will not have missed anything you cannot come back for. Let your jaw come unclenched. You have probably been holding it since this morning without noticing. We have a few slow hours, and we can take them at whatever pace the dark wants. If pieces made like this are worth making, subscribing helps more than almost anything else. And one question to carry down with you, if you want something to hold, is there something you are genuinely good at that you have never once been able to explain to another person? I do read the answers. We begin where he began, on a road in the western provinces, with a boy of 13 and a grown man who had agreed to fight him. There is a notice board at the edge of a village in the west of Japan in the last years of the 16th century, and pinned to it is an open challenge. The man who put it there is called Arima Kihei, and he is a professional. He belongs to the Shinto school, one of the old established fencing traditions, with a lineage and a curriculum and a reputation to trade on, and what he is doing is what men of his kind did in those years. He travels from province to province. He posts a challenge in each place he stops. He takes on whoever comes forward, and when it is finished, he moves on with his name slightly larger than it was before. This was a living. In a country that had been tearing itself apart for over a century, there was steady work available to anyone who could demonstrate, in public, that he was very good at killing people. What comes to meet him is a boy of 13. We know the boy as Miyamoto Musashi, though that is not what anyone called him then. He was not born with that name and would give it to himself later. What he has, at 13, is a father in the trade, whatever he has picked up around the house, and a piece of wood about 6 feet long. The account says his guardian had already gone to Arima Kihei to apologize on the boy's behalf and to explain that the challenge had been accepted by a child and that Kihei, being a reasonable man, had agreed to let the matter drop if the boy came and said so himself. The boy came. He did not say so. What happens next takes perhaps 4 seconds. Kihei draws, a real blade, against a child with a stave, and the boy does the one thing that nobody trained would do, which is to come straight forward into the arc of it instead of stepping back out of range. He gets inside. He puts the man on the ground, and then he finishes it there, on the ground, with the staff, and the professional swordsman of the Shinto school is dead in a field outside a village whose name we are no longer sure of. Stay in that for a moment, because it is worth standing where the man stood rather than where the boy did. You are grown. You have 15 years of formal practice behind you and steel in your hand, and the thing walking toward you is a child, and you are about to lose everything you have to it in the time it takes to draw breath. There would have been no room in it for surprise. It would simply have happened. Now, what is actually in that scene, if you take the drama out of it? A 13-year-old did not fence a professional because a 13-year-old cannot fence a professional. What he did instead was remove the conditions under which fencing decides anything. All of Kihei's advantage lived at a particular distance, in a particular kind of exchange, with a particular weapon doing particular things, and the boy simply refused to have the fight there. He took it to the ground, where 15 years of studying the sword bought his opponent nothing at all. He also happened to be holding a longer, heavier weapon than the other man, and he had chosen it. 47 years later, an old man in a cave would write a long and rather scornful chapter about fencing schools that fall in love with their own techniques and forget what a fight actually is. He would argue that obsessing over the blade is a way of losing, that the shape of the contest matters more than skill inside it, and that whoever controls the terms has already won before anything is drawn. He wrote all of that as a mature theory, hard-won, tested for decades. And the first time we ever see him, he is 13 years old and doing it without a theory at all, without a word for it, apparently without thinking about it much either. The house he came from is only partly visible to us. His father was Shinmen Munisai, Shinmen Muni-sai, and he was the real thing, an accomplished fighting man known for the sword and for the jite, an iron bar with a hook set near the grip, designed to catch a blade and take it away from the man holding it. Consider what a household looks like when the family expertise is disarming people. His mother died when he was very small. There was a stepmother. There was, in some tellings, an uncle who was a priest and who did what he could. And the father is remembered as cold, though I want to be careful with that, because the stories about Munisai and his son were written down more than 100 years after both of them were dust, and hard fathers are the easiest thing in the world to invent for a man who turned out like this. What can be said is narrower and probably heavier. He grew up in a house where fighting was the family business, beside a man who was demonstrably good at it, and for years he would have been the one who was not. If you have ever done something dangerous or excessive, partly to settle an account with someone who was never going to be impressed, you know a version of the weather in that house. Even the ground under his birth is unstable. He wrote plainly that he came from Harima, Ha-Riema, a province on the inland sea. A tradition just as old puts his birth in a village one province over, and both places have claimed him for 4 centuries and still do. He gives his own age in his book as 60. Another account has him dying at 62. The most famous swordsman in the history of Japan is a man whose birthplace and birthday are both still arguable. And here I have to stop admiring the story long enough to say what it is. A man was killed. He had a name, which is more than most people got, and he had it only because he was the first. He came to that village to earn a living in the ordinary way of his profession. He was owed an apology, he had agreed to accept one, and instead a boy arrived with a longer weapon and beat him to death while he was down. Read it without the mythology, and it is not a duel in any sense that word usually carries. It is a homicide with a socially acceptable frame around it, committed by someone who was not old enough to be held to account, in a country that had made a great deal of room for exactly that. Then there is the harder problem, which is that we have almost nothing. One line survives in Musashi's own handwriting: that his first duel was at 13, that he struck down a strategist of the Shinto school, and that the man's name was Arima Kihei. That is the whole of the primary record. There is no independent trace of Kihei anywhere. The notice board, the apology, the guardian, the staff, the 4 seconds, all of that comes from biographies compiled a century and more after the fact by men who had inherited the school Musashi founded and every reason to want its origin to be extraordinary. I have read that single line many times, and I still cannot decide what tone it is in. It sits in a passage where he is listing his victories, which sounds like a boast. It sits 4 sentences away from the place where he says the victories were probably worth nothing, which is the strangest thing in this whole chapter, and I want to leave it with you rather than resolve it. The person best placed to demolish this story is Musashi. He is the only witness. If he had wanted a legend, he had every opportunity, and instead he wrote it down flatly in a few clauses and then undercut it himself. Whatever that boy had in the field that day, the man who had been that boy spent the rest of his life refusing to call it greatness. He did it again at 16, against someone he describes as able, which from him is a considerable word. And at 21 he walked into the capital, where a single family had been teaching the country's military rulers to fence for 4 generations, and knocked on the door. Your hands may have closed while you were listening to that. They usually do when a story has a fight in it, and it happens well below the level where you would notice. Let them open. There is nothing in this room to hold. Whatever that boy's heart was doing 400 years ago in a field on the other side of the world, yours is slowing down, and it is allowed to. Kyoto used to be known, among other things, for a particular black. Getting a true black out of natural materials is slow work. You cannot do it in a single pass. You build the colour over days, dipping the cloth and drying it and dipping it again, layering one dye beneath another until the fabric stops handing anything back to the light, and the households that could manage it properly were few, and they kept the method to themselves. The name attached to the finest of that work in Kyoto was Yoshioka, Yosh-i-oh-ka. The same name in the same city belonged to the most prestigious fencing school in Japan. For 4 generations, the Yoshioka had been sword instructors to the shoguns, the military rulers who governed the country in the emperor's name from a palace inside that city. An appointment of that kind made a family permanently significant. There was only one difficulty with it by the time this story arrives, which is that those shoguns had ceased to exist. Their house had been broken and driven out in 1573, 30 years earlier. Power had moved east and then moved again. Kyoto itself had been burned so thoroughly and so repeatedly during the wars that whole districts were still going back up. Whatever the Yoshioka name meant by then, it had been inherited from a court that was gone. They were not the establishment. They were a monument to one. In the spring of 1604, a 21-year-old from the provinces with no school behind him, no patron, and no letters of introduction, presented a challenge to the head of the house. The terms were reasonable and public: wooden swords and 1 blow to settle it. They met on open ground at the northern edge of the city, on land that had long been used for burials, and Yoshioka Seijuro, arrived at the appointed hour and waited, and went on waiting because Musashi did not come. When he finally did arrive, the head of the most famous fencing family in Japan had been standing in a field for a considerable time in front of an audience, and was no longer a calm man. The fight lasted 1 exchange. Musashi struck him once, on the left shoulder, hard enough to put him on the ground and to end the use of that arm permanently. Seijuro survived. He shaved his head, gave up the world, and was finished as a swordsman at a stroke. The younger brother took the headship and demanded satisfaction, which was the only thing he could reasonably do. They met outside a temple hall on the eastern side of the city, the long one, with 1,000 gilded figures standing shoulder to shoulder in the dark inside it. Real blades this time, and Musashi came late again, and the second brother died there. Look at what the family had done across those 2 meetings. They had escalated from wooden swords to steel, and it had made no difference whatever, and now they had no adult left to send. The headship of a 400-year-old military house passed to a boy of 12. What they arranged next was not a duel. They named the child as the challenger, which was necessary for the form of the thing, and then they gathered several hundred men, students, retainers, whoever could be raised, with swords and with bows, and they took them out before dawn to a pine tree on the northeastern edge of the city, and they waited there for one person to walk into it. Be one of them for a moment, because that is the harder place to stand. It is cold and it is dark, and you have been told where to put yourself and when to move. Most of the men breathing around you have never killed anybody. Some of them are barely older than the child you are supposedly there to support, and the child himself is somewhere near the middle of it, holding a sword he has no business holding, being used. The whole plan requires exactly one thing from its target, which is that he arrive at the agreed hour like a gentleman and be surrounded. He did not. He came early. By the time the Yoshioka were arranging themselves in the dark, Musashi was already there, off among the trees, watching them do it. There is a story that on the road that morning he stopped at a shrine and began to pray for victory, and then took his hands apart and walked on without praying, having caught himself reaching for help from somewhere outside himself. I doubt it happened. It is exactly the sort of scene that gets added to a life afterwards. But the sentiment in it is not invented, because 40 years later, dying, he wrote down that a man should respect the gods and never once count on them, and whoever put that story on the road to the pine tree understood something true about him. What he did when he came out of the trees was go straight for the child, not through the ranks, not toward the strongest men, not defensively, directly at the 12-year-old at the center, because the boy was the challenge, and with the challenge dead, the several hundred people standing in that field had no formal reason to be there at all. He killed him. Then he cut his way out through the crowd, and got clear. The boy's name was Yoshioka Matashichiro. Matashichiro. It is here, in the tradition, that the two swords first appear. Musashi is remembered for fighting with the long sword and the short sword at once, one in each hand, and a great deal of mystical language has been draped over that arrangement in the centuries since. His own explanation is a piece of engineering. 2 hands on one hilt, he said, is not free. It is slow to reach either side, and it is close to useless from a saddle. Whether or not he first drew both blades at that pine tree, the sense of it is obvious in that field. A man with one sword has one direction. A man surrounded does not have the luxury of a direction. Now the objections, and there are 2, and neither of them is small. The first is that the Yoshioka themselves told it differently, and their records dispute the account we have just walked through. Think about where our version comes from. The story of an unknown provincial destroying the country's most prestigious sword school in 3 meetings reaches us largely through the tradition that Musashi founded and the men who inherited it, and it is precisely the story a new school would want at the head of its history. Rival houses have always tended to collapse convincingly in one another's paperwork. The second objection cannot be handled that way, and I have tried. The killing of that child is not a late embellishment by an admirer. It is on the memorial stone raised in 1654, 9 years after Musashi died, by his own adopted son, which makes it one of the earliest things recorded about him by anybody. Of all the vivid material attached to this man, an enormous amount of it turns out to be soft, added later, borrowed, or invented outright. The mourning at the pine tree is not. The hardest thing to forgive him is among the best attested. I have gone round this for a long time, and I do not have a clean position on it. The tactical logic is unanswerable. The boy was the reason the ambush existed, and going through several hundred armed men to reach him afterwards would have killed Musashi. Every part of that is correct, and it does not help at all. He was 12. Someone had dressed him and sent him out. And here is where it lands strangest. Having destroyed the most famous fencing house in Japan before he was 22, he had nothing to show for it. Nobody hired him. No lord took him into service. No school opened its doors. No fortune arrived. He had made himself the most conspicuous, dangerous young man in the capital, and the capital had no use whatever for such a person, and so he left. He spent the next 8 years moving, and what anybody remembers from those years is a single morning at the end of them, on a sandbank in a fast strait between 2 islands, against a man whose name may not have been his name. Nothing in the room where you are lying has an opinion about any of this. That is one of the genuinely useful properties of a dark room at this hour. It will hold a story you have not worked out how to feel about for as long as you like, without once asking you to settle it, so you can put the boy down. He has been dead for 400 years, and the dark is not going anywhere. Twice a day, the sea changes its mind between the 2 big islands of southern Japan. The gap there is narrow, less than a kilometer at the tightest point, and an enormous volume of water has to move through it every time the tide turns. So it runs. It runs hard enough to be dangerous, several times faster than a person can swim, and then it slows and stops and comes back the other way, and any boat crossing that water has to be launched inside a window that the sea decides rather than the sailor. Sitting in the middle of it, low and unremarkable, is a sandbank of an island small enough to walk across in a few minutes. In the spring of 1612, it was called Funashima, and almost nobody had any reason to go there. Here is the story as it is told, and it is one of the great stories. Waiting on that island is Sasaki Kojiro, the finest swordsman in Western Japan, and the last serious rival Musashi has left. He carries a blade so long that people have given it a nickname, the drying pole, after the poles you hang laundry from. It is far longer than a normal sword, and he handles it as though it weighs nothing, and he has a signature cut that people describe by comparing it to a swallow turning in the air, doubling back on itself faster than the eye can follow it. He is on the beach at the appointed hour with the officials and the witnesses, and he is ready. Musashi does not come. An hour passes, then more than that. On the island, a very good swordsman with a formidable reputation stands in front of an audience with nothing to do, and the sun climbs and the water turns. Out on the strait, in a small boat, Musashi is calmly whittling a spare oar into a wooden sword, judging the length by eye, making it deliberately longer than the drying pole. He arrives late, wades ashore, and Kojiro, furious now, which was the entire point of the lateness, draws his sword and hurls the scabbard away into the water. Musashi looks at it going and says the line that everybody knows. "If you have no further use for your sheath, you are already dead." Then he puts the sun behind him, and they come together once, and Kojiro is dead on the sand with his skull broken by a piece of boat. That is the most retold fight in the history of Japan, and you can see why. Everything in it is doing work. A man of enormous formal skill is beaten by a man who refuses to meet him on formal terms. The famous weapon is defeated by an oar. The rage is manufactured on purpose, and the calm is the weapon underneath the weapon. It is a complete lesson in about 90 seconds, and it has been painted, staged, filmed, and printed so many times that it has stopped feeling like history and started feeling like something closer to scripture. Now here is the other account. 9 years after Musashi died, his adopted son had a memorial stone raised on the mainland shore within sight of that stretch of water. It stands about 15 feet high, and it is covered in an inscription about his father's life, and it is by a long way the earliest external record we have of any of this, closer to the events than anything else in this story by roughly a century. It describes the fight on the island as coming from people who were there. According to that stone, the man on the beach was called Ganryū, not Sasaki Kojiro, just Ganryū. He carried a naked blade about 3 feet long, which is a sword and a substantial one, but is not a legendary pole. Musashi fought him with a wooden sword, and this was arranged beforehand. It was a term of the contest, stated in advance, in the open. One man would carry steel and the other would carry wood. It was not improvised on a boat, and it was not a surprise. And on the matter of the lateness, the stone says nothing at all, because in that version, the two men reached the island at the same time. Almost every detail that makes the famous version famous enters the record over 100 years later, in biographies written when everyone who could have contradicted them was long dead. Those later books do not even agree with each other. One says Kojiro landed first, another says Musashi did. Each arranges it to flatter Musashi in a slightly different way, and the man himself is thinner than his fame. There is no contemporary document from the early 1600s that records a swordsman called Sasaki Kojiro at all. The full name appears clearly for the first time in a book from 1776. The often repeated detail that he was 18 years old seems to come from someone in the previous century misreading an old phrase about Ganryū making his name at 18 and turning it into a birth date. The grave that is supposed to be his gives the name slightly differently again. There is a decent argument that Ganryū was not the name of a school he founded, but simply the name he went by, in which case the island in the strait is named after a man about whom we know almost nothing except that he lost. Because that is what happened to the island. Fukushima is now called Ganryūjima, Ganryū's island. It is named for the loser. Musashi, who won everything, has no island. I should admit something because I have caught myself doing it while writing this. I want the ore to be true. The ore is so good. And when I look at why I want it, the answer is that it makes a better anecdote, not that it makes a better man. Sit with what the older account is actually describing, because it is stranger than the legend and considerably harder to shrug off. In the famous version, the wooden sword is cunning, a trick, secretly longer, sprung on an opponent who never sees it coming. In the version closer to the event, it is a proposition. Musashi says in advance, in front of officials and witnesses, that he will bring a piece of wood and the other man may bring a sword. That is not clever. That is a public wager on an idea, and the idea is that the weapon is not the thing that decides, and the other man agreed to it, which tells you that Ganryu also believed the weapon decided things, and therefore believed he had already won before he stepped onto the sand. So the fight was an argument, conducted once, with a real answer at the end of it, and what 400 years of retelling did was take out the argument and put in a trick, because a trick is a better story even though the wager is a better idea. The whole of Musashi's later thinking is that idea, worked at for decades. It survived in his book and it fell straight out of his legend. There is probably something you do this with, in a much smaller way. Most people are carrying a story about themselves that they have now told enough times to have polished. A decision that has become sharper in the retelling, an argument in which your replies have improved over the years, a version of a bad night that is now better shaped than the night was. You can no longer separate what you remember from what you have made. It is not lying, and there is no moment where it happens, and it is more or less how memory works. He was 28 years old on that sandbank, or 30, depending on which birth year you accept. By his own written account, the dueling stopped at 28 or 29. He would live another 30-odd years and never fight a famous fight again. You may notice, if you are close to going under, that the details of this are already loosening. The length of a blade, which island, who arrived first. That happens to everyone at this hour. And it happens to be exactly what happened to this story over 4 centuries. The specifics went first, and the shape stayed, and the shape came out neater than the truth had been. There is nothing to do about that tonight. Let the details go. They were never the part that mattered. You were good at something once, and you stopped, and if somebody asked you tonight why you stopped, you would probably give them a reason that is not quite the reason. It is still partly in your hands. Not all of it, but enough that you can feel the shape of what it would take to get it back. The months of being bad at it again. The particular tiredness of it. The evenings. You know roughly what the cost is. You could begin again on Thursday, and you are not going to, and the honest position is that you have never entirely worked out why not. Because the story you tell about it has a gap in the middle where the actual decision should be, and there was probably never a decision there at all. It simply stopped happening, and then enough time passed that it had stopped. Musashi has that gap too, and his is enormous, and it sits in plain view in the opening pages of his own book. Read what he writes there slowly, because it is stranger than it looks. He gives his first duel at 13 with a name attached. He gives the second at 16 with a name attached. He says that at 21 he went up to the capital and won everything he was offered, and that afterwards he travelled from province to province taking on schools, and that he never lost. Then comes the number, and the number is not clean. He says he had as many as 60 encounters, not 60, as many as 60. The most decisive man of his age is hedging on the count of his own life's work. And then he closes the whole account with a date that is also not a date. This was between the ages of 13 and 28 or 29. He does not know when he stopped, or he knows and cannot be bothered to be precise, which is somehow worse. And then he says nothing about it. There is no explanation, no turning point, no scene. In a book that goes on to describe in exact detail how to hold your shoulders, where to put your eyes, how to breathe when a man is coming at you, and what to do about the ground under your feet. The single largest turn in his life is handed over in a subordinate clause and abandoned. He was 60 years old writing that passage. 16 years of his life go past in about 4 sentences, and everything the world would eventually know him for is inside them. Do the arithmetic on those years, because it deflates something worth deflating. 60 fights across 16 years is under 4 a year. However you picture the wandering swordsman, and the picture most of us carry is essentially continuous combat, one road, one challenge, the next town. The reality was closer to a fight every 3 or 4 months, with the rest of it being weather, walking, sleeping badly, being hungry in a country that had been at war for a century and was very bad at feeding people, waiting for someone to accept. Most of the famous years were not the famous thing at all. They were a young man travelling without money in the cold between occasional afternoons of extreme violence. And the country he was travelling through was in the middle of shutting down the profession he had chosen. The great battle of the age was fought in the autumn of 1600 at a place called Sekigahara, and the side that won went on to rule Japan for 2.5 centuries. The consequence for men like him was immediate and enormous. The losing lords had their lands confiscated or cut, and every household that shrank turned its surplus retainers out, and something on the order of 400,000 trained fighting men found themselves without a master. The word for such a man was ronin, R-O-H-nin, and it meant, more or less, a wave man, someone drifting. 14 years later, when the last of the old ruling family made their stand at Osaka, perhaps 100,000 of those men went there to fight, largely because there was nowhere else left to be a soldier. Osaka ended. Under the third of the new Tokugawa rulers, the number of masterless men in the country approached 500,000, and the government had begun treating them, frankly, as a security problem, pushing them out of the cities and restricting where they could live. Many went into farming. Many became townspeople. A very great number simply came down in the world and stayed down. So the loneliness that gets described as Musashi's philosophy was first an economic condition shared with roughly 500,000 other men. His own part in any of it is close to invisible. Whether he was at Sekigahara at all is genuinely unsettled. The popular account puts him on the losing side. An old and better informed source puts him somewhere else entirely, down in the south with an experienced campaigner who was raising irregular volunteers, and his father's name turns up in the muster records of a clan that fought for the winners. The memorial stone raised by his son is vague to the point of uselessness on the question. He may have been at the siege of Osaka in the winter of 1614 and the summer that followed, carrying a banner and guarding a commander's son, or he may not have been. The most famous warrior of his century has no battle we can put him at with confidence, which brings us to the question I cannot answer, and neither can anybody else. Why did he stop? There is a heroic reading, and it is his own, that he had understood something, or realized he had not understood anything, and turned to working out which. He does say that afterwards he studied morning and evening looking for the principle. That is a real answer, and it may be true, but set the others beside it at full strength. The new piece was quietly closing the space he had lived in. Killing a professional in a field had been a career move under the old arrangements and was becoming, under the new ones, an administrative problem for somebody. He was getting older, and a man of 29 is not a man of 19, and that gap is felt first by exactly the sort of person who can feel it. He had also by then destroyed the most prestigious fencing house in the country and killed the best-known swordsman in the West, which is the kind of record that stops the queue forming. There may simply have been nobody left willing to step out in front of him for the small money and the large risk. And there is one more possibility that nobody who writes about him ever says out loud, which is that he had a bad morning somewhere on a road we have no record of, and something in him quietly declined to do it again. He never tells us. In a book that explains everything, the one thing he does not explain is the turn the whole rest of his life hangs from. What strikes me hardest, though, is not that he stopped. It is that he did not replace it. Most people who lose the thing that defined them substitute something within about a year because the shape of the day demands it: a position, a business, a title, students, a house. He had a reputation that could have been converted into any of those things, and he had 30 years in which to do it, and for the great majority of them he did not. He kept moving. He taught a little. He stayed as somebody's guest and then left. He built almost nothing, which for a man of that ability in that century is close to inexplicable, unless he genuinely believed he had not finished learning something and did not want to be found sitting down. What he did do, starting in those years, was begin taking in other people's sons. Your breathing has changed since we started, and you did not authorize that either. It happened the way most of these things happen, underneath the level where you would notice without a moment you could point to. Which is worth mentioning because falling asleep is the one stopping nobody has ever been able to account for. You will not catch the moment. Nobody ever has. You will simply be somewhere else, and it will have already happened, and there will have been no decision anywhere in it. In the summer of 1626, inside the newest and finest castle in Japan, a young man of 22 is putting his affairs in order. The castle is Himeji, Himeji, and it is only about 17 years old in its present form, brilliant white, enormous, the sort of building people travelled to look at. It is still standing today, which is unusual for a Japanese castle and is the reason you have probably seen it without knowing what you are seeing. The lord of it has been dead for a matter of days. He was 30 years old and he died of tuberculosis, which in that century meant a long and undignified decline in front of everyone who served him, and his wife was the shogun's own granddaughter, a woman who had been carried out of Osaka Castle while it burned. This was, in other words, one of the most consequential households in the country, and one of the most watched. The young man putting his affairs in order is called Miyamoto Mikinosuke, and he is Musashi's son. Not by blood. He was born into a middling samurai family, the third of 3 boys, and Musashi adopted him at about 11 and raised him from there. Musashi also placed him, taught swordsmanship to the retainers of that household, used what standing he had, and got the boy in as a page to the young lord. A page is not a servant in the ordinary sense. A page is in the room. He dresses him, attends him, sleeps near him, is present for the small hours of the man's life, for years on end, and the bond that forms is not a professional one. What Mikinosuke is arranging in that room is his own death. The practice was called junshi, following in death, and it meant exactly that. When a lord died, certain of the men closest to him would open themselves with a short blade and go after him, and it was understood as the highest thing a retainer could say. He did it. He was 22 years old. Stand where he was standing, because it is not as foreign as it looks from here. You are young and you are very good at a thing that only exists in relation to one person, and that person is now dead, and the entire household is going about its business around you with everybody carefully not looking at you. Nobody has told you to do anything. Nobody will. But you know precisely what is expected, in the way that you always know, without a word being said, exactly what is expected of you at a funeral or in a hospital corridor, or when a family decision is being made in a room where nobody will say the thing out loud. And you know as well that if you do not do it, that will also be a statement, and it will follow you for the rest of your life, and everyone who was in that castle will remember which way you went. The choice had largely been made by other people before he ever got to it. That is what makes it terrible. And the government eventually agreed. Less than 40 years after that summer, the shogunate banned yunshi outright, and the reason was not squeamishness. It was arithmetic. The practice functioned like an arms race. Once one man did it, everybody who did not looked cold, and so households were losing their best young retainers in batches, precisely the men they had spent 20 years training. A domain would bury a lord and discover it had also buried the next generation of its administration. Whole houses were quietly hollowed out by a gesture. Set against that, Mikinosuke's death was not a tribute. It was pure subtraction, and it purchased nothing for anybody, including the man it was addressed to, who was already dead. I find I cannot get all the way to that, though, and I want to be straight with you about it rather than pretend to a verdict. A person of 22 decided that one bond was worth every year he had left, and did the arithmetic out loud and went. We do not have an equivalent. Calling it social pressure is accurate, and it is also not enough. Musashi had, by then, another son in the house. Iori, Ohri, had been adopted 3 years earlier, at 11, so for a short window there were two of them. The records disagree about where he came from. One genealogy makes him Musashi's own nephew, the son of his eldest brother, born in the same small district on the inland sea where Musashi himself was probably born. What is not in dispute is what happened to him afterwards, and it is worth going slowly through the numbers, because the numbers are the argument. A samurai's standing was measured in rice, specifically in units of roughly the amount it takes to feed one person for a year. It is a clean measure of what a man was considered to be worth. Iori entered service with one of the great Western houses at 15 as a page, the same starting position his brother had held. By around 20, he was carrying an income equivalent to feeding 2,500 people for a year, and was counted among the principal men of the domain. After a campaign in his mid-20s, he was raised by another 1,500, which put him at 4,000, and at 26, he held the highest rank in the household. He kept it. He lived to 65 and died in his bed in 1678, 33 years after his adoptive father. Musashi, at the absolute peak of his life, at 56, in the best arrangement he ever secured with any lord, was on 300. The adopted son out-earned him by more than 13 to 1, and got there before he was 30 in the ordinary way, by taking service and being useful and staying. So here are the two of them, raised by the same man, and neither one confirms him. One took the world of loyalty and attachment entirely seriously, and it killed him at 22. The other took the world of loyalty and attachment entirely seriously, and it made him rich, respected, and long-lived. What neither of them did was the thing their father did, which was to refuse the whole arrangement and go and live at an angle to it for 40 years. And the last turn in this is the one that quietly reorganizes everything else. That memorial stone, the 15-foot one on the mainland shore with the inscription that gives us the earliest account of the island, the earliest account of the ambush at the Pine, the earliest account of anything, Iori raised it. 9 years after Musashi died, the son who had taken the salary and the rank and the house and the lord, the son who had done every single thing his father declined to do, paid for the stone that tells us who his father was. Almost everything we can say with confidence about a man who spent his life refusing to belong to anybody reaches us through the one person in the story who belonged completely. He is also, obviously, not a neutral witness. He was a son in a stone-carving mood, with a family name to establish in a domain full of people who knew exactly how his father had lived. And he is still the closest thing to a witness that exists. In the winter of 1637, Iori went to war for his lord. His father, then in his 50s, went with him, under the same commander, in the last real fighting Japan would see for 200 years. None of this needs settling now. Whether that boy at Himeji did something magnificent or something merely obedient is a question that has stayed open for 400 years, which means it has already proved it can wait, and it will still be exactly where you left it in the morning. And by then you may find you have no particular appetite for it, which is also a perfectly good answer. Above the walls of the castle there was a banner, and the writing on it was not Japanese. It was Portuguese. Angels either side of a chalice and a line of text praising the most holy sacrament, hand-painted on cloth and hung out over a ruined fortification on a peninsula in the far southwest of Japan in the winter of 1637. The banner still exists. You can go and look at it. It is one of the strangest surviving objects in Japanese history, and beneath it, inside those walls, were something like 37,000 people, and most of them were farmers. The place is called Shimabara, and what happened there was not a war between armies. The land had been ruled for a generation by Christian lords, and a great many of the people on it had converted, and then the lords changed, and the new administration set about extracting revenue at a level that has no reasonable defense. Taxes were demanded in full through consecutive years of failed harvest. Families who could not pay had their daughters taken. There was a punishment used on defaulters in which a person was wrapped in a straw rain cape and set alight, and it was common enough to have a nickname which tells you all you need to know about how often it was done. On top of that came the campaign against the Christians, which by then meant torture designed not to kill, but to produce recantations. People were being starved, burned, and asked to deny what they believed, in that order, for years. So they rose, and the rising had a figurehead, a boy of about 16 called Amakusa Shiro, who was said to walk on water and call birds down onto his hand, and who was believed by a great many desperate people to be exactly what he appeared to be. They took an abandoned castle at Hara on a headland above the sea, and they went into it with their families. What came for them was the full weight of the state. Something over 100,000 men eventually surrounded that headland. The first commander sent to break the castle got impatient, attacked, and was killed under its walls, and the government replaced him with someone more careful, who settled in to starve them out. At one point, a Dutch ship was brought round and asked to shell the position from the sea, which produced the peculiar spectacle of Northern European Protestants firing on Japanese Catholics as a favour to the shogun. And riding somewhere in that enormous besieging force, attached to the household his son served, was Musashi, then in his 50s. The account of how he was dressed comes down to us in some detail, and it is the part I keep going back to. He wore no armour. Under his clothes he had a silk damask undergarment. He carried 2 daggers and a staff about 5 feet long. That was the whole of it. No helmet, no cuirass, nothing that would stop anything in front of a fortification held by desperate people, and when the stones came down off the wall, he knocked them away with a stick. I genuinely cannot decide what the silk means. It reads as absolute confidence, a man who has calculated the risk precisely and finds it acceptable. It also reads, if you turn it slightly, as an aging celebrity making sure he is recognizable at a distance. Possibly, there is no difference between those two things at 55. The stones are worth understanding properly, because peasants threw rocks makes it sound like improvisation. It was not. The defenders had firearms taken from the armories of the district, and for months they used them. What happened as the siege went on was that they ran out of powder, out of shot, out of food, out of everything, and what a garrison does at that point is take apart what is left of the castle and throw it. Cooking pots, roof tiles, stones off the walls they were standing on. That is the condition the place was in when a stone came off the top of it, crossed the winter air, and hit the most accomplished swordsman in Japan hard enough to put him on the ground with his horse walking away. You know the specific flavour of that, even at a much smaller scale, being hurt by something that had no skill in it. A step in the dark you had used 1,000 times, a wet tile, a door you have opened every day for 11 years. There is pain, and then behind the pain there is a small separate insult, which is that the thing that got you was not trying and had no craft, and could not have been beaten because there was nothing there to beat. He wrote about it afterwards. In a letter to a lord he corresponded with, Musashi mentions the injury and makes one flat undertaking, which is the closest thing to a joke that survives from him, and possibly not a joke at all. I will not be hit by stones again. The siege ended in the spring. A prisoner told the besiegers that the people inside had eaten everything, including the seaweed off the rocks, and the final assault went in against defenders too weak to hold the walls. What followed was not a battle either. Very close to everyone inside was killed, men, women and children, in the region of 37,000 human beings over a few days. The boy was beheaded and his head was taken to Nagasaki and put on display. The lord whose taxation had started, it was eventually executed himself, the only lord in 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule to be beheaded, which tells you the government understood perfectly well what had been done to those people. It also tells you that understanding it did not save a single one of them. Be inside the walls for a minute, and then we will let it go, because it is not a place to stay. You have been in there for 3 months. Everyone you have is in there with you. You have run out of powder, and then out of rice, and then out of the seaweed, and the thing you are holding is a stone you have levered out of the wall behind you. Below you is the largest army assembled in Japan in a generation, and among them, on a horse, in silk, is an old man batting your stones out of the air with a stick. He is on the other side. That is the thing to say plainly and not soften. The greatest swordsman who ever lived spent his last campaign helping to put down a famine revolt by starving farmers, and it ended in a massacre, and no reading of his life gets around that. He did not command it. He does not appear to have decided anything. He was there in an advisory capacity, which in some ways is worse, because it means he was one of the men standing near the decision, being consulted and lending his enormous prestige to it. And here is the peculiar shape this leaves. For a man whose entire reputation is combat, we have almost no combat. Whether he was at the great battle of his youth is unsettled. Whether he was at the siege in his 30s is unsettled. The one campaign in 60 years that historians can actually place him at, with a document to hang it on, is this one, and at it, he does not fight anybody. He rides about, unarmored, in an advisory role, at an atrocity, and gets knocked off his horse by a rock. What was he even doing there? He had no lord. He was in his mid-50s, decades past the last duel anyone remembers. He went because his son's people went, which made him a distinguished elderly relative attached to a household he did not belong to, riding out to the last war in Japan. It is possible that is the whole answer, that it was the last war there was ever going to be, and he knew it, and he was not going to sit it out. 2 years afterwards, a great lord in the south sent for him and offered him something he had spent his whole life declining. Nothing is coming over the wall at you tonight. That is not a small thing to notice, and it is worth actually noticing rather than assuming. The room is holding, the door is where you left it, the temperature is fine, and everything outside is somebody else's 400-year-old winter. You are extremely safe. You may as well let the walls do the work. They have been managing without your supervision all evening. Nobody had ever asked him to write it down. That is worth sitting with, because it is easy to assume a mind like his spent decades being consulted. It did not. For most of his life, what a swordsman was for was demonstration and instruction. You hired one to teach your retainers how to hold a blade and where to put their feet, and if he was famous, you got some reflected credit, and nobody expected him to have a philosophy any more than you would expect one from a good gunsmith. He had taught in a few households. He had students. And in 56 years, so far as anything survives to tell us, not one person had ever said to him, "Sit down and set out what you actually think." Then, in about 1640, an invitation arrived from the south. Kumamoto sits in the middle of the western half of the southern island, and the domain attached to it was among the 2 or 3 richest in Japan, an enormous holding with a castle to match. The lord of it was Hosokawa Tadatoshi, and he was not a dilettante about any of this. He had trained seriously in swordsmanship himself under the school of the shogun's own fencing master, which is to say under precisely the tradition that Musashi had spent his life declining to join. He was in his 50s. He was, by every account, taken seriously by the people who worked for him. What he offered Musashi was a place. The terms have come down to us in 2 incompatible versions, and I will come back to that because the difference matters more than it looks. And then he asked him the question. What came back in the 2nd month of 1641 was a document of 35 short paragraphs on strategy. 35 articles written to order for one named reader. The first time in his life that anything Musashi thought had been committed to paper because somebody wanted it. It is a compressed thing, dense and a little abrupt, and it is the direct ancestor of the book he is now known for. Whole passages of the later work are visible in it in outline, the way a building is visible in its foundations. He was 57 or so. He had been carrying this material unwritten for 30 years. Hosokawa Tadatoshi died on the 26th of April that same year, roughly 2 months after receiving it. The household's grief can be measured, because in that period it was measured, and it was extraordinary. Something like 18 or 19 of his retainers followed him into death by their own hand. A wave of it, one of the largest and most famous instances in the history of the practice, and the sort of thing that still gets written about centuries later. That is what this man was to the people around him. Musashi did not follow him. The man who had lost the only patron who ever asked him a serious question, the man whose own adopted son had made exactly that choice 15 years earlier, and whose second son was serving in a household where it would have been understood, stayed alive. And 2 years later, he walked up a hill and started writing the whole thing again from the beginning, 4 times as long, properly, for nobody. Now, the objections, because there are several, and I do not think any of them can be waved off, start with the terms of the arrangement, which the sources cannot agree on. One account has Musashi becoming a retainer of the Hosokawa outright, an official rank, 17 men of his own under him, an income of 300, and a residence in a castle in the city. Another insists, just as firmly, that he never became a vassal at all, that he was received as an honoured guest, given a modest personal stipend and a support allowance and a house to live in, and remained formally free. The difference is not administrative. One version says the great independent finally took service at 56. The other says he found a way to be looked after without ever bending. 400 years on, we cannot tell which happened, and I notice that everybody who writes about him picks the version that suits the Musashi they already have. Either way, he took the money. The man who would eventually write that you should not seek goods or estates for your old age spent his old age in a castle residence on somebody else's rice. And here is the harder one. The whole story I have just told you, the Lord who finally understood him, the question nobody else thought to ask, the mind recognized at last, is a story I want to be true, and it may be considerably more ordinary than that. Very rich men collect things. A famous old swordsman with a legendary record and no fixed address is a magnificent thing to have about the place, and asking him for a written account of his art is exactly what a wealthy patron does with an interesting acquisition. Musashi was old, ill, and poor. He may have been grateful rather than understood. Recognition and collection look identical from the outside, and often enough from the inside as well. He began having attacks of nerve pain the following year. In 1643, he left the city and went up onto the western slope of a dead volcano that stands behind Kumamoto to a cave in the grounds of an old Zen temple. The place is called Reigando, Reigan-DOH, and it is not large. There is a stone cannon figure set inside it, which is why the site had a name long before he got there. It is open to the weather on one side. He was about 60, in pain, and he went up there to write the thing again. There is a decision in that which I think most people recognize in a smaller form. You have said something once, under pressure, in the time available, and it came out compressed and half-right. An explanation, an apology, an account of yourself, 35 paragraphs when it needed 130. It went. It is out in the world in that shape. And you can either let it stand, which is what almost everyone does and what is usually sensible, or you can go back and do it properly, knowing that the person it was for is not going to read the second version. He went back. I only noticed this recently, and it has stayed with me. The book he wrote in that cave carries no dedication. The 35 articles were addressed to a man by name. The long version, the one that has lasted 4 centuries, is addressed to nobody at all. And the very first thing he sets out in it is not a sword or a stance or an enemy. It is a carpenter. You are probably past the point where you would retain any of this if you tried, and I want to say clearly that there is nothing to retain. The thing about anything genuinely worth understanding is that it does not depend on your holding it tonight. It will sit exactly where it is. He spent 2 years in a cave getting one document right because he knew he was running out of time. You are not running out of anything. Let it go a bit blurry. That is the correct response at this hour, and it costs you nothing at all. Go into a timber yard early before the work starts. Wood is stacked everywhere in it, in long racks with air gaps between the boards, because green timber has to be seasoned slowly or it splits, and some of what is in that yard has been sitting there for years doing nothing but drying. The place smells of resin and sawdust and a little of damp, and the man who runs it walks the stacks in the morning and looks at them, and what he is doing is reading the grain, the knots, which way a board has begun to cup, which lengths have gone slightly out of true while nobody was watching. He is deciding what each piece is for. The straight, clean, handsome timber goes into the parts of the building that people will see and that hold the weight. The pieces with a twist in them are perfectly good for scaffolding, where it does not matter and will come down again when the work is finished. What is left after that gets burned. This is Musashi's picture of command, and he sets it out early, and he means every part of it. The commander, he says, is the master builder. He must know the plan of the whole thing before anyone starts. He must know the local measures and materials and customs. He must keep his tools sharp and sharpen them in the gaps between jobs rather than when he needs them. And he must know his men the way that man knows his stacks. Which of them will hold weight in the visible part of the structure, which are sound enough for temporary work, and which are, in the end, firewood. Most of the writing about that passage treats it as charming. Look at what it actually says. He is comparing people to lumber and sorting them by grain, without embarrassment, without softening it anywhere, and the reason he is not embarrassed is that he is right about the job. A commander who cannot look at 40 men and say which 3 can be relied on when it goes wrong will get all 40 killed. It is a genuinely useful way to see, and it is a cold way to see, and the whole of the rest of this chapter lives in the gap between those 2 facts. The word he uses throughout is hyoho, hyohoch, and it has a double sense that he exploits deliberately. It means military method, the running of armies, the thing a general does. It also means the art of the sword, the thing one person does with a blade in a field. He refuses to separate them. His entire claim is that the principle which decides a war and the principle which decides a duel are the same principle at different sizes, and that if you understand it at one scale, you understand it at all of them. From one thing, he says, know 10,000 things, which is why, when he sets out the rules for anyone wanting to learn this, they are not about swords. There are 9 of them, and they are short. He starts with honesty. Do not think dishonestly, which in his usage is less a moral instruction than a warning that self-deception is a technical fault, the same category of error as a bad grip. Then, the way is in training, meaning that none of this is available by thinking about it. So far, unsurprising. The next 2 are the strange ones, and they are the reason he is worth reading at all. Become acquainted with every art. Know the ways of all professions. That is a man who kills people for a living, instructing his students to go and look at other trades, at carpentry, at how a merchant judges a market, at what a dancer does with time, at the way a good craftsman holds a tool, not as a broadening exercise, as technique. He believed the structure was visible everywhere, and that you could not see it in your own art until you had seen it in somebody else's. Then come 4 rules about perception, and they get progressively less comfortable. Distinguish gain from loss in ordinary matters. Develop your judgment about everything. Perceive the things that cannot be seen. Pay attention even to trifles. And then the 9th, which governs the other 8. Do nothing which is of no use. It has been quoted so often and lifted into so many books about focus and decluttering and doing one's best work that it now arrives sounding almost cozy. Cut the distractions. Simplify. It is not cozy. Read it as an actual criterion applied without exceptions and see what it does. Look around the room you are lying in, or around the rest of the house in your head, and find the things you have not touched in a year. Not the useless things. You already know about those. The things you keep because they were a gift, or because of who you were when you bought them, or because throwing them out would be a statement about something. A jacket that no longer fits any version of your life. A box you have moved house with twice and not opened either time. Under the 9th rule, all of that goes, and so does most of what you did last Sunday, and so does the conversation you had at work that was pleasant and went nowhere, and so does any affection that is not doing a job. And by every indication, that is how he lived. No wife, no household, no school building, no compound, no succession of students in a permanent place, almost no possessions. Later, dying, he would write down that a man should not pursue fine food, should not keep things he does not need, and should not acquire property for his old age, and by then he was simply describing what he had already done for 60 years. I tried it, incidentally, for about a week in the small way available to a person with a normal life. It was clarifying for 2 days, and then it became quietly unbearable. And what broke it was not laziness. It was that almost everything I actually value failed the test, which raises the question the rule cannot answer on its own. Useful for what? A criterion of usefulness needs an end to be useful toward. For most of his 20s, the end was obvious, winning and staying alive. But the fighting stopped at 29, and he kept pruning for another 30 years. Useful for the way, he would say, and never stray from the way. But the way is the thing that was supposed to make you win, and he had stopped needing to win. There is a circle in there that he does not close, and I do not think it can be closed, and it may be the most honest thing about him that he leaves it open rather than inventing a purpose to sit at the end of it. Set beside him, then, a man who died 5 years before Musashi's first duel, and who worked the same principle in the opposite direction. Sen no Rikyu was the greatest tea master in Japanese history, and his art was subtraction. He made the tea rooms smaller and then smaller again, down to 2 mats, the size of a large cupboard. He took out the ornament and the imported treasures and used plain local things, rough bowls, a bamboo scoop he cut himself. And he built the entrance low, deliberately low, so that every guest had to kneel and crawl in, and no one could bring a sword through it. A ruler and a fisherman entered that room in the same posture, unarmed, and knelt down opposite one another over hot water and powdered leaves. By Musashi's criterion, every single thing in that room is of no use. The whole art is of no use. It is one of the supreme achievements of Japanese civilization, and Rikyu's subtraction killed him. In 1591, the most powerful man in Japan ordered him to open his own stomach, and the reasons are still argued over 4 centuries later. A statue placed where the ruler had to walk beneath it, a dispute over the pricing of tea things, a daughter, an accumulation. Underneath all the versions is the same fact, which is that an aesthetic of nothing unnecessary is always, silently, a verdict on everyone who has too much. He was about 70, he made tea, wrote a poem, and did it. So the 9th rule cuts both ways, and it will not tell you which way to hold it. Stripped of everything that does not serve, a life becomes extremely clear and can also become uninhabitable. And if you are strict about it in public, in a world of people who are not, you should understand that you are making an argument whether you mean to or not. You do not have to decide about any of this tonight, and I would gently suggest that you do not try. There is one thing you could usefully drop, though, and it is small. The muscles around your eyes are still working. They have been all evening, tracking, adjusting, holding a very slight readiness even with the lids down, because that is what they do all day, and nobody ever tells them the day is over. Whatever they are preparing for is not going to happen here. By his own rule, that effort is of no use at all, and it can go, and everything under it is allowed to go soft. The part of the human eye that actually sees sharply is roughly the size of a thumbnail held out at arm's length. That is the whole of it. Everything outside that small circle is peripheral vision, which is coarse, poor at detail, close to useless for reading, and cannot really tell you what color something is at the edges. It feels as though you are seeing a whole wide, clear world in front of you, but you are not. You are seeing a thumbnail of sharpness, moved around very quickly by muscles you never think about, and your mind is assembling the rest from memory and habit and stitching it into something that feels seamless. Here is the test of that, and it costs nothing. Think of a face you looked at today, properly looked at, in conversation, for minutes. You can probably still see it. Now describe what was behind it. The wall, the objects on it, what was on the surfaces to either side, whether the light was coming from the left or the right. Most people cannot. You spent all your resolution on the face, and the room simply did not get recorded. And then the strange half of it. If I asked whether that room was tidy, or whether it felt cold, or whether there was anyone else in it, you would almost certainly know. You did not look at any of that. You have it anyway. Musashi built a doctrine out of exactly this, 400 years before anyone could explain the anatomy. He uses 2 words. One is kan, and the usual translation is perception or insight, the seeing that goes through a thing. The other is ken, which is ordinary looking, the eye on the object. And his instruction is blunt and slightly shocking the first time you meet it. The gaze should be broad and wide, and of the 2 kinds of seeing, perception is strong and sight is weak. I should say that the 2 words are close cousins in ordinary Japanese, and English has to strain a little to hold them apart, and I am not entirely confident the full weight of the distinction survives the crossing. What is not in doubt is what he tells you to do with your eyes, because he is very specific about it. Look at distant things as though they were near. Look at near things as though they were distant. Do not move your eyeballs about. keep them still and take in both sides. And this is the line that gives the whole thing away. Know where the other man's sword is without looking at it. Stand there for a second, because this is not abstract. Somebody is in front of you and he is going to try to kill you with a blade. Every instinct you have puts your eyes on the blade because it is bright and it is the thing that will do it, and it is moving. That instinct is a disaster. The sword is the last part of the system to move. By the time the tip tells you anything, the decision was made some time ago in his hips and his back foot, and the small change of weight that happened before his hands did anything at all. And all of that is happening in your periphery, which is bad at detail and superb at motion, and which reports faster than the sharp part of your eye can even get there. Watch the sword, and you learn about the attack. At the moment it becomes an attack. Watch nothing in particular, and you learn about it while it is still an intention. So the wide gaze is not a mystical posture, it is a way of buying time by refusing to spend attention, and he extends it past the eyes into the whole way you carry yourself, which is where it starts to be about more than fighting. Your bearing in combat, he says, should be no different from your bearing in ordinary life. He gets almost fussy about it. Do not tense the forehead. Do not screw up the space between your eyebrows. Keep the neck straight, the shoulders down, the face you have when nothing is happening. Not because calm is virtuous, but because every one of those adjustments is information leaving your body and arriving at somebody else's, and because a face that has braced belongs to a person who has already committed to something. The general instruction underneath it is that there should be no gap between how you are when it matters and how you are the rest of the time, which is either a very high standard or an extremely restful one, and I have never worked out which. Now, the objection, and it is stronger than the people who quote him tend to admit, trained perception is also trained blindness. There is a well-known experiment in which radiologists, people who look at medical images for a living with genuinely superb pattern recognition, were given scans to search for the small nodules they search for every day. And hidden in one of the images, large, obvious, unmistakable to anyone off the street, was a picture of a gorilla. Most of them did not see it, not because they were careless, because expertise is not a general improvement in seeing. Expertise is a decision made in advance and thereafter invisible about what counts as worth seeing, and everything outside that decision quietly stops arriving. Musashi's gaze is a trained gaze, tuned to one situation. It is optimized to detect a body preparing to move inside about a quarter of a second at conversational distance. That is a superb instrument, and it is an instrument, and instruments have shapes. Set against it the opposite discipline. Nothing has ever been found under a microscope by someone taking a broad view. The entire structure of the modern world was built by people staring at one small thing for an unreasonable length of time, deliberately excluding the periphery, on purpose for years. A botanist counting stamens, a copyist checking one letter against another, somebody who has looked at the same 12 bars of music 400 times. Narrow sight is weak in a fight, and it is the strongest tool anybody has ever had for finding out what is true. There is a further cost, and it is the one that actually worries me. A perception trained on intention will read intention everywhere. If you spend 40 years learning to detect what a person is about to do from the set of their shoulders, you do not get to switch it off across the dinner table. You become someone who is always, faintly, reading the room for a shift of weight. And that is not presence. It is surveillance, with good manners on top of it. It may be part of why a man that's skilled at reading people never lived with any of them. Buying that quarter of a second is only half of what he wanted, though. The other half is what he does with it. And what he does with it is the strangest thing in the book, which is to stop an attack before the other man has finished deciding to make one. Still, there is a version of this available to you right now, and it requires nothing, and it is the restful half of the doctrine rather than the vigilant one. Your eyes are shut, and there is nothing to look at, but the same architecture runs on sound. You have been listening to one thing, a voice, narrow, focused, the auditory equivalent of that thumbnail of sharpness. Let it widen, not by concentrating. Concentration is the other tool. Just stop aiming and notice how much was already there. The room has a sound floor, something in the building, or the weather outside, or the small noises a house makes settling. Traffic a long way off, maybe. All of it has been arriving all evening without being looked at. That is the whole of what he means. You have not laid eyes on this room since the lights went off, and you know precisely where everything in it is: the door, the window, the edge of the bed, the floor. You are perceiving it right now, continuously, without a single act of attention, and it is completely accurate, and it took no effort at all. That is the strong kind. It has been running this entire time, and it will keep running after you have stopped, and it does not need you. Somebody you know well takes a breath in a particular way, and before a single word has arrived, you already know what the sentence is going to be. Not the wording, the shape of it, the subject, the register, roughly how long it will run, and how you are going to feel when it stops. You did not deduce that. There was no reasoning anywhere in it. Something in the intake of air, or the angle of the head, or the fact that they put their cup down first, and the whole thing was already legible before it existed. Everyone has this. It is one of the ordinary miracles of living near other people for a long time, and it is also, in a form sharpened for about 30 years, the most disturbing technique Musashi ever wrote down. He calls it holding down the pillow. The image is of putting your hand on someone's head as they try to lift it off the bedding so that they never get up at all. And the instruction is that you do not wait for an attack and counter it, and you do not even meet it as it begins. You meet it at the first syllable. His translators usually reach for a device to get this across in English, and the device is a fair approximation of what he is doing in Japanese. If the man in front of you is about to attack, you suppress him at the A. If he is about to jump, you take it at the J. If he is about to cut, you have already arrived at the C. Nothing has happened yet at that point. That is the entire content of the technique. You are not responding to an action because there is no action. You are responding to the front edge of a decision that is still assembling itself inside another person's body, and you are getting there first and doing it repeatedly so that everything he tries dies at the moment of conception, and he never once completes a movement in the whole encounter. Be in front of him for a moment, because the physical version is easier to accept than the psychological one. You are close, not fighting distance as films present it, with room to circle, close enough that if you both extended an arm, you would touch. He is going to cut you, and the sequence in the real world is not blade then body. It runs the other way. The back foot loads, the hip turns very slightly, the shoulder drops perhaps a centimetre, and only afterwards does the sword do anything at all. Every one of those precedes the strike by a margin that is small in ordinary terms and enormous in this one. Musashi's whole method is to live inside that margin. Not to be faster than the sword, nobody is faster than the sword, but to be operating one stage upstream of it, at the place where the thing is still only intended, which brings in the second half, and this is where it stops being about eyes and starts being about time. The word he uses is hyoshi, and it is usually rendered as timing or rhythm, though it is broader than either. His claim is that everything has one. There is a rhythm to a fight, obviously, but there is also, he says, a rhythm to a dancer, and to a flute, and to the strings, and he tells students to go and study those directly. There is a rhythm to a merchant's fortune, the rise and the plateau and the decline, and to the fortunes of an entire household, the generations in which a family comes up and holds and then quietly goes down, and the fact that these have a shape which can be read from inside them if you know what you are looking at. And there is the one that took me longest to understand, which is the rhythm of what is absent. He talks about a timing of emptiness, the beat that is not struck. Anyone who plays music knows this without needing it explained. The rest is not the absence of the piece. The rest is part of the piece, and it is often the part doing the most work, and a musician who cannot play a rest cannot play. His argument is that a fight has rests in it too, and that most people only perceive the notes. There is a companion idea, and it is the humane one in the middle of all this. He tells you to become the enemy, meaning, quite literally, to think yourself into his position and reason from there. And the example he gives is beautiful. People think of a bandit barricaded in a house as a formidable enemy, he says, because he is armed and cornered and dangerous. Go and stand inside the house. From in there, you are one man. The entire world is outside, and it is organized, and it is coming. You are a pheasant, and the thing in the doorway is a hawk. The man everyone outside is frightened of is, from the inside, the most frightened person in the district. He also holds, and I love this one, because it is so odd and so obviously true, that states of mind are contagious and can be deliberately transmitted. If you become genuinely unhurried, he says, the other man will start to become unhurried, and you can use that. Yawning does it. So does boredom. So does calm. You give someone your condition without either of you agreeing to it, simply by being in the room in a particular way for long enough, which is more or less what has been happening to you for the last couple of hours. Now the difficulty, and I do not think it can be talked around, this is a doctrine of striking first, and the vocabulary of attentiveness does not change that. Inside a duel, it is perfectly clean. Two people have agreed to try to kill each other. The intention you are reading is real, and getting there at the A is simply doing the job well. Take it out of that field, though, and what you have is a method for acting on somebody's intentions before they have acted on them. That is the logic of the preemptive strike, of the preventive war, of ending a relationship first, because you have decided the other person was going to. And the trap in it is that you can never audit yourself. If your reading is excellent, you will be right most of the time, and most of the time is precisely the figure that makes this catastrophic, because a successful preemption destroys the evidence. You suppressed it at the first syllable. Now there is no way on earth to find out whether the word was going to be what you thought it was. You have a perfect record and no way to check it, which is the definition of a belief that cannot be corrected. There is a domestic version too, and it is quieter, and I recognize it. Somebody who meets you at the syllable before the word is somebody you cannot finish a sentence in front of. They are never wrong about you, and they are never surprised by you, and being never surprised by a person is a fairly reliable way of not actually meeting them. I have read this passage often enough that I have caught myself doing it, and I am not convinced it has made me better company. Musashi would have an answer, and it is a fair one. He is describing a man in a field who is about to be killed. He is not describing your kitchen. He wrote for a specific emergency in a century full of them, and if people since have taken a manual for the last 4 seconds of somebody's life and applied it to their careers and their marriages, that is not obviously his mistake. Although he did also insist repeatedly that the principle is the same at every scale, which makes it at least partly his mistake. He wrote all of this for a world of duels, and there was a man alive at the same time in the same country, teaching the same art at the highest level in the land, who had gone through the identical material and come out believing something close to the opposite. Whatever you have coming tomorrow has not formed yet. That is worth saying plainly, because the mind at this hour has a habit of reaching upstream and trying to meet things early. The conversation, the appointment, the thing you have to say to somebody. There is nothing there to meet. It has not loaded its back foot. Nothing has moved. You are entirely off duty until it does, and it will arrive at its own hour tomorrow, at full size, in its own time, and you will deal with it then. And there is no version of tonight in which getting there first helps. In a hall in Edo, the city we now call Tokyo, the ruler of Japan is taking a fencing lesson. He is the third of the Tokugawa shoguns. He is in his late 20s, and he governs perhaps 18 million people absolutely. The man correcting his grip is called Yagyu Munenori, Yagyu Munenori, and he taught this shogun's father as well. He is around 60. He was born into a fighting family in a mountain village, and he has converted that inheritance into something no swordsman in Japanese history had achieved before. He is a lord in his own right, with land and an income and a domain that bears his family's name, and he is one of the small number of men the ruler of the country listens to in private. He is, in other words, everything Musashi was not, in exactly the same trade, at exactly the same time. In 1632, Munenori finished a book. It is a treatise on his school's swordsmanship and on how the same principles run a country, and it is organized around a distinction he took from Zen and made famous. There is the sword that deals death, and there is the sword that gives life. The first is the obvious one, the blade as an instrument for ending people. The second is the difficult one, and it is his whole argument, that the highest use of the art is not to kill efficiently, but to control violence. That a man who kills one person in order to save 10,000 has used his sword to give life rather than to take it, and that skill which is not answerable to something beyond itself is simply a hazard walking around in human form. Underneath that sits a piece of genuine philosophy, which he had from the Zen priest Takuan Soho, Taku Ahen Soho, who wrote him a long letter on the subject that is still read. The idea is a mind that does not stop anywhere. Attention that settles on the sword is caught by the sword. Attention that settles on your own technique is caught by that. Anywhere the mind lands, it sticks, and while it is stuck, you are not available for anything else. The trained state is a mind that moves through everything and adheres to none of it. That is a serious position, argued by a serious man, and it is not soft. It is also, and this is the part that stops me every time, the doctrine of the chief of the secret police. In the same year he completed that book, Munenori was appointed to the office that oversaw the shogunate's surveillance of the great lords, the machinery of inspection and informing that kept 260 domains from ever combining against the center. The man who wrote the life-giving sword ran the regime's intelligence service. You can read that as the perfect proof of his teaching, violence disciplined and put to the service of a peace that genuinely lasted 2.5 centuries. You can also read it as the exposure of it, because the life-giving sword is precisely what any power has always called its own knife. And what was Musashi doing while that book was being written? He was somewhere in the West, unemployed, with no students to speak of, and he was preparing to write a chapter about how everybody else was a fraud. The fourth scroll of his book is titled Wind, and by that he means tradition, the old schools, the current ones, the family lineages. It is the least attractive thing he ever wrote, and probably the most revealing. He goes through them by type. The schools that build everything on a very long blade get taken apart for depending on reach, because reach is not available in a corridor. The schools built on the short sword are dismissed as passive, waiting for gaps, useless the moment there is more than one opponent. Schools with elaborate catalogues of stances are selling variety. Schools that prize strength of stroke do not understand that a committed cut is a gift. Schools with named footwork patterns get a particularly dry response. The ground, he points out, is uneven, and there are marshes and rivers and rocky fields and narrow roads, and you cannot go hopping about on any of them. Then he gets to speed, and here he is, genuinely good. Real timing does not look fast. A person who has it does not appear to hurry and never falls out of rhythm, whereas someone in a rush is by definition slightly behind and compensating, and then he says the thing that made him unforgivable. The other schools, he writes, have inner teachings and outer teachings, a gate you enter, a graded curriculum, secrets released to you as you rise, licenses at the end. In his art, there is no gate and no interior. There is nothing withheld. There is no secret at all. Understand what that costs the people he is talking about. The system of secret transmission was not decoration. It was the business. It was how a school held its students for 20 years, how it charged, how a license to teach retained value, how a lineage survived a generation. Saying there are no secrets is not a philosophical remark. It is a man walking into an entire profession and announcing that the product does not exist. So put yourself in an obvious position, one that thousands of actual young men were in. It is around 1630, and you are 20 years old, with some ability and a life to spend. One path leads to a great school with a hall, a curriculum, a certificate at the end of it, a name that opens doors, and a plausible route to a salaried position in a domain administration where you will teach the sons of retainers and die at 60 with a house. The other is a man in his 40s with no premises, no lineage, no paperwork, no connections worth having, who will tell you at the outset that there is nothing to be initiated into and that most of what you learn should come from watching carpenters and listening to music. Nearly everybody chose the first. They were not being cowardly, they were being sane. By every measure available in his own century, Munenori won. He won the rank, the land, the students, the influence, the ear of the ruler, the school that still exists. He died in 1646 with his family established and his ideas installed at the center of the state. Musashi died the year before in a cave with a manuscript. 400 years later, the book people actually read is the one from the cave. I want to be careful here because there is a comfortable story sitting right there, the neglected genius vindicated by time, and it is mostly false. Musashi's posthumous victory owes an enormous amount to accidents of publishing, translation, and one 20th century novelist, and very little to any tribunal of merit. And I notice, when I check myself, that I want him to be right, and that a good part of the reason is simple snobbery about worldly success. The man who died poor must have been the honest one. That is not an argument. It is a reflex, and it is a cheap one, and Munenori may simply have been correct that skill unanswerable to anything is a danger. There is a third voice worth putting in the room, and it arrives late. 80 years or so after Musashi, in a domain in the far southwest, a retired retainer spent 7 years dictating his thoughts to a younger man, and the resulting book is called Hagakure, Ha-ga-kure, and it contains the single most quoted sentence about the samurai ever written, that the way of the warrior is found in death. It has been treated ever since as the definitive statement of the ethic. The man who said it never fought a battle in his life. He was born 14 years after Musashi died, into a peace that was already 2 generations deep. When his own lord died, he wanted to follow him and was forbidden, because by then the practice had been banned, so he shaved his head and went to live in a hut and talked instead. His book was not published. It circulated quietly inside one domain for 2 centuries before anybody outside noticed it. Set that beside Musashi, who did the fighting and who states plainly that the true way of strategy is to win. The most famous doctrine of glorious death was composed by a man in a hut who was not permitted to die, and the flattest insistence on simply surviving came from the only one of the three who had actually stood in a field with someone trying to kill him. I am not going to tell you which of them was right. I have read all three for years, and I move between them depending on the week. Having spent a whole scroll explaining what everyone else had wrong, Musashi wrote one more. It is by a long way the shortest thing he ever produced. It is about nothing at all, and I mean that precisely. You may find, if you are close to the edge now, that the disagreement you have just been listening to has quietly stopped feeling like a disagreement. That happens at this hour. The positions do not get resolved, they lose their corners, and both of them turn out to be perfectly holdable at the same time, and the effort of keeping them apart goes out of you. Philosophy cannot get to that state by working at it. Sleep hands it over for nothing every night to everybody. 4 of the 5 scrolls are the work of a man being extremely thorough. The one about individual technique tells you where to put your feet and how far apart, what the fingers do on the hilt and which ones grip and which stay loose, how to hold your head, 5 separate guards, and when each is right, named strikes with instructions for each. The one about fighting runs through a dozen distinct methods with names attached and explains the terrain and the sun and what to do about several opponents at once and how to end a deadlock. The one about other schools goes through the competition category by category and takes them apart. This is a man who does not leave gaps. He has been at it for 2 years in a cave in pain, and he is being as complete as a person can be. And then there is the 5th one, and you can read the whole of it in the time it takes to boil a kettle. It is called the Scroll of Ku, which is the ordinary Japanese word for empty, and also the technical Buddhist term for emptiness, and it is usually given in English as the void. What it says, more or less in full, is this: the spirit of the void is where there is nothing. By knowing the things that exist, you can know that which does not exist, and that is the void. What most people call the void is not the void at all. It is simply the point where their own understanding stops, and mistaking one for the other is an error. And when the mind is not clouded anywhere, when the fog of confusion has gone out of it, what remains is the true version. That is essentially the content. He worked toward it for 2 years, and it fits on a page. Take the middle line by itself, because it is the one with actual teeth in it, and it is easier to test than it looks. Knowing what exists is how you know what does not. Anyone who has lived with a small child understands this in the body. You sleep through an astonishing amount of noise, the crying, the thumping, the door, the neighbors. You do not sleep through the wrong kind of silence. Something in you has built, without instruction, a complete model of what that house sounds like when everything is all right. And the moment a piece of it goes missing, you are awake and moving before you have any idea why. You did not detect a sound. You detected the absence of one. And you can only detect an absence if you are carrying a very exact picture of the presence. That is not mysticism. That is expertise, described accurately. The doctor who knows what a healthy chest sounds like hears the quiet patch. The mechanic hears the noise that is not there anymore. Every genuinely skilled person spends most of their working life perceiving things that are not happening, and none of them find this strange. So one reading of that last scroll is completely down to earth. He is saying that after decades of knowing exactly what is in front of you, you acquire access to what isn't, and that this is the top of the craft rather than anything supernatural. The support for it is strong. He goes out of his way to warn against calling your own bewilderment the void, which is an anti-mystical move and a slightly irritable one. And at the very end of his life, he would write down as a rule to live by that a man should honor the gods and the Buddhas and never for a moment rely on them, which is not the sentence of somebody expecting to be met by anything. The other reading is also strong, and it starts with the structure of the book itself. Earth, water, fire, wind, void. Those are not his invention. They are the 5 great elements of Buddhist cosmology, a scheme that was already 1,000 years old and completely familiar. And the 5th of them, emptiness, carries an enormous freight of religious meaning. To a reader in his century, calling your last chapter that was not a neutral choice, it announced a destination. And he was writing in a cave in the grounds of a Zen temple with a stone cannon figure a few feet away, and the language he reaches for, the clouds clearing, the unclouded mind, is the standard vocabulary of exactly that tradition. On this reading, he is not describing expertise at all. He is describing arrival, and he spent his life getting there, and the reason the chapter is short is that there is not much you can say about it. I have held both of these at different times, and I notice the one I hold depends less on the evidence than on how I am that year, which is not a distinguished way to reason about anything. And then there is a third possibility that almost nobody says out loud, "So I will." He committed to 5 elements. That was the container he picked, and it is a good container, and it gave him 4 chapters of superb material. Then he arrived at the 5th slot, which the scheme required him to fill, and he was 60-odd and ill, and had already said everything he actually knew, and he wrote a page, not because he had transcended language, because the structure had a hole in it, and he was running out of time and there was nothing left in the bag. That reading fits the physical evidence perfectly. It is unfalsifiable in the other direction too. You cannot prove a man was not enlightened, and I mention it mainly because the alternative is that we treat brevity as automatic proof of depth, which is a habit worth examining. Here is what I think is really going on, and it is about us rather than him. We require last chapters to be profound. A dying master's final page is not permitted to be thin. There is enormous pressure in the reader for the end of a life's work to arrive somewhere. It is the same instinct that makes people lean in for deathbed sentences and go away satisfied with whatever they get. Nobody reads the 5th scroll of that book neutrally, because by the time you reach it, you have been traveling with the man for hours and you want the ending to pay. You could decide not to require that. It is available to you tonight, and it costs nothing, and it is the more generous position by some distance to let the last page of a life be short and possibly unfinished, and possibly a little disappointing, and to let that be all right, without needing it to mean something on your behalf. Whatever he had or did not have in that cave, he was doing one other thing in those years with exactly this problem. He was putting ink on paper and then leaving almost all of the paper alone. Your body is not holding anything up at the moment, and it has probably not entirely noticed. Most people lying down keep a small amount of work going in the shoulders and the upper back, a residual bracing that made sense at some point during the day and has had no function whatsoever for hours. Nothing is going to fall. The bed is taking all of it and has been all evening and is extremely good at this. You can let the last of it down now and there will be nothing underneath, and nothing is exactly right. Put a loaded brush onto absorbent paper and the paper takes the ink instantly and keeps everything. There is no correcting it. You cannot paint over it because the ink has gone into the fibers rather than sitting on top of them, and you cannot go back and thicken a line without the join showing. Everything about the moment of contact is recorded permanently and at full resolution. How fast the brush was moving, how hard it was pressed, how much ink it was carrying, a brush running dry drags and splits and leaves a broken streaked line with white gaps torn through it, and a brush 2 wet floods and blooms outward past where you wanted the edge. Any hesitation at all appears as a small pool where the hand paused, and it is visible forever to everybody from across a room. So a brushstroke on that paper is a complete record of the state of the person who made it at the second they made it, and it cannot be edited afterwards. I do not think it takes much to see why a man who had spent his youth in single exchanges with people trying to kill him would find that interesting. It is the same architecture. One attempt, no revision. Total commitment at the moment of contact, and an outcome that reports honestly on your condition, whether you like it or not. A duel and a brushstroke share a structure that almost nothing else in life has, and Musashi is one of the very small number of human beings who was seriously good at both. There is one difference, and it is the whole reason an old man does this. If you are wrong with a sword, you die. If you are wrong with a brush, you have wasted a sheet of paper. Same discipline, identical demand, and the consequence removed entirely. Which means the brush is a place where you can go on practicing the thing that once decided whether you lived safely every day until your hands stop working. He signed the paintings Ni-ten, which is a name from his school and not the one he fought under. It is a small thing, and I keep noticing it. The painter had a different name. The best of them hangs in a museum in Osaka Prefecture and is registered by the Japanese state as an important cultural property. It is called shrike on a withered branch, and it is mostly nothing. A bare vertical branch runs up the sheet, dead, stripped, done in something very close to one dry stroke with the split and broken texture of a brush that was almost out of ink. Near the top there is a small bird. Lower down, climbing, is a caterpillar, and that is all of it. The rest of the paper, which is most of the paper, is left alone. Now, what a shrike actually is, it is a songbird. It is roughly the size of a sparrow, it has no talons worth the name, and it looks, at a glance, like something you would put on a Christmas card. It is also a predator that kills insects, lizards, small mammals, and other birds, frequently things close to its own size, and because it has no feet built for holding prey down while it feeds, it solves the problem by impaling the body on a thorn or a broken twig and leaving it there. A shrike's territory has a larder in it, a spike hung with corpses in various stages of drying, kept for later. The practice is common enough in Japan that the language has a word for it. So the most famous killer in Japanese history, at the end of his life, painted a small bird that murders things larger than itself and hangs them on spikes, sitting on a branch with nothing left alive on it, and put a caterpillar underneath it, climbing. I want to be honest that I am now doing to a painting exactly what I have spent this whole night complaining that people do to his life. There is no evidence he meant any of that. He may have liked shrikes. Ink painters had been doing birds on branches for centuries, and it was a completely standard subject, and reading a confession into it is precisely the reflex that turned an ordinary duel on a sandbank into scripture. I still cannot look at it without seeing what I see. Another one, and this one is harder to explain away. He painted Hotei, the fat wandering monk with the sack, the figure who stands in that iconography for contentment and for owning nothing, and he painted him watching a cockfight. Two birds going at each other to settle which of them is dominant, and the subject of the picture is not the fight. The subject is the man watching it and finding it funny. And there is a wooden figure he carved of Fudo-myo, the wrathful guardian, the immovable one, who in every version of this iconography for 1,000 years holds his sword in one hand and a rope in the other, standing in fire. Musashi carved him holding the sword in both hands, raised beside the head, which is not how the deity is depicted by anybody. It is how a swordsman stands. Given a block of wood and a god to make out of it, his hands did the thing his hands knew. He worked in more than one material, the paintings, calligraphy, sculpture, at least 2 sword guards, a pair of folding screens. He had no teacher in any of it. He said so himself, more or less in passing, that he had practiced many arts and had no teacher in them, which is the sort of remark that would be insufferable if it were not, as far as anyone can tell, true. Now the objection, and it is not a small one, Japanese ink painting is a tradition with giants in it. Sesshu, who died about 80 years before Musashi was born, went to China to study, worked at it for a lifetime, and produced landscapes that are among the great achievements of world art. Set the Shrike next to that, and Musashi is a gifted amateur, a very gifted one, an amateur, and a substantial number of the works with his name attached are attributed rather than certain, which means the name is doing work the brushwork cannot do on its own. There is also the plain market fact, true of every artist, and especially true of this one. A painting by the most famous swordsman in history is worth more than an equally good painting by somebody nobody has heard of, and cultural property status attaches to significance, which is not the same thing as quality. The honest position is that the Shrike is genuinely very good. The economy of it is real, the branch is real. The decision to leave that much paper untouched is a decision somebody made and got right, and that nobody alive can tell you whether it is great, because nobody has ever looked at it without already knowing whose it was. Set that aside and consider where he was standing. You are around 60. The thing you were feared for is finished and has been for 30 years. Nobody is going to test you, and the body that did it has begun failing in the specific way that does not reverse. What is left is a pair of hands that have been trained past the ordinary limit for a task that no longer exists. Most people in that position stop. He found the one activity in the world that made the same demand of him, and did it without an audience for years until he died and left behind about a dozen sheets of paper. For 300 years afterwards, almost nobody looked at them, and then, in the 20th century, something happened to his reputation that had nothing whatever to do with painting or with swordsmanship or with anything he had actually done. Nearly all of that room is empty, incidentally. If you took out the furniture and the walls and everything solid, the overwhelming majority of the volume you are lying in is air and nothing, and you never once think about it, because it is not the part that seems to matter. It is the part holding you up right now. There is a great deal more nothing in that room than there is anything, and it is completely quiet, and none of it needs your attention at all. In the summer of 1935, a novelist began publishing a serial in Japan's biggest daily newspaper, and the man he was arguing with had been dead for a year and a half. The novelist was Yoshikawa Eiji, and the serial was called Musashi. It ran, an episode at a time, in front of an enormous readership for 4 years. And the thing that started it was a literary quarrel. Another writer, Naoki Sanjogo, had been publicly taking the Musashi legend apart, arguing that the stories were inflated, that the record would not bear the weight people put on it, that the greatest swordsman in Japanese history was substantially a fiction assembled after the fact. He was right. He was, in almost every particular that this evening has touched, correct. He also died in 1934, aged 43, before the serial began. So the rebuttal ran unopposed for 4 years in front of millions of people, and it did not merely win the argument, it replaced the subject. Naoki's name is now on one of Japan's 2 most prestigious literary prizes, awarded every year, and nobody outside the field remembers what he said about Musashi. Yoshikawa's version is what the world means when it says the word, and Yoshikawa's version is largely invention. The wandering monk who finds the young Musashi half feral after a battle, ties him to a tree and forces him to become a person, invented, or more precisely lifted. The monk was a real and important historical figure, but he was the Zen teacher of Musashi's great rival, and there is no evidence the 2 men ever met. The young woman who waits for him across the years while he perfects himself, whose devotion is the emotional engine of the whole thing, invented outright no such person. the framing of the swordsman on the island as a lifelong destined rival, the shadow self, the other half of a matched pair. That is a novelist's structure, imposed on a man we cannot even reliably name. What Yoshikawa built out of a handful of fights and a book was a 4-year story about a violent boy who becomes a disciplined man through hardship, correction, love, and relentless self-improvement. It is, by every account, extremely good. That is not a small part of why it worked. The years it ran are worth stating plainly without drawing a conclusion I cannot support. It began in 1935. In the second year, elements of the army attempted a coup in Tokyo. In the third, the war with China became total. It finished in 1939. So, a daily serial about a young man forging himself through discipline and suffering and finding his highest expression in mastery of the sword was the ordinary reading of a very large number of Japanese people during exactly the period in which the country mobilized for the worst decade in its history. The novel is not a war story and it does not preach conquest, and I am not going to pretend it was propaganda because it was not. What I will say is that stories do not land in a vacuum, and that a nation reads what it needs, and the fit between that book and that moment was extraordinarily good. After the war, it went outward. In the mid-1950s, a director made 3 films from the novel with Toshiro Mifune, in the part, and the first of them took the Academy Award for Best Foreign Film, which put that Musashi in front of the world. Decades later, a manga artist adapted the same novel again and sold it by the tens of millions. Every one of those is an adaptation of Yoshikawa. None of them is an adaptation of the sources. Then there is the other career, which is stranger. The first commercial English translation of the Book of Five Rings appeared in 1974. It sat quietly for a few years, and then in the early 80s, American business discovered it. Japan was out-competing the United States in industry after industry. Nobody could explain why, and here was a text from the culture in question about strategy, written by a man who had never lost. A magazine piece from 1981 captured the moment perfectly. An advertising executive, a genuinely famous one, was telling American businessmen to go and buy a copy and study it. And the reason he had it in the first place is that he had been given it by a legendary Japanese baseball pitcher. From a pitcher to an ad man to Wall Street. An American edition eventually went out with a subtitle claiming it was the classic text that changed the American way of doing business. Executives read the passage about suppressing an opponent at the first syllable and took it into salary negotiations. The best line in that whole episode comes from the same magazine piece, and it is from a senior correspondent at a Japanese financial newspaper who was asked about the craze and replied that Japanese businessmen were far too concerned with the future to go rummaging around in the past. Americans were reading a 17th century dueling manual to decode a business culture that had never opened it. So here is what the 20th century did, and it is the thing this entire evening has been circling. Almost every famous person is surrounded by a version of themselves that grew slowly, in the dark, over centuries, with nobody's fingerprints on it. This one is different. This one has an author, a start date, a publisher, a motive, and a print run. You can go and look at the machinery. And now the difficult part, which is that the invented version may be doing more good than the real one. Millions of people have read that novel and come away steadier, with a sense that character is something you build rather than something you have, that discipline is available to anybody, that a bad start does not settle the matter. That is a fine thing for a book to do. The historical man beat somebody to death at 13, crippled one brother and killed another, killed a 12-year-old and spent his last campaign on the wrong side of a massacre. You cannot get a self-improvement tradition out of that. The false Musashi can carry a weight the true one simply cannot bear. Which puts the decision in front of you now that you have both of them, and it is a real decision rather than a rhetorical one. You can keep the corrected version, which is more honest and considerably colder. You can keep the story, knowing what it is. Or you can do what I suspect most people do, which is hold both without integrating them in separate compartments and take whichever one is useful that week. I should be straight about my own position in this, because I have been doing the same operation all night with different taste. The Musashi I have given you, the skeptic, the man who audited his own record and found it wanting, the one who could not explain why he stopped, is a selection. Every fact in it is defensible, and the selecting is mine. I chose that man because he is the one I find interesting, which is precisely what Yoshikawa did, and the only real difference between us is that he was better at it and had 4 years and a newspaper. There is a version of you in circulation too, among people who know you slightly. It is not accurate. Some of it is generous and some of it is not, and none of it is quite the thing, and you have almost certainly tried at some point to correct one part of it and discovered that corrections do not travel the way the original did. That version will outlast anything you say about it. It is worth knowing that, and it is not worth losing sleep over, and the people who love you are working from a different document anyway. Underneath all of it, in the 5th month of 1645, there is still a man with about a week to live, giving away everything he owns. You will run into the legend again tomorrow. In a film someone mentions, a quotation on a wall, a line in a book about business, and you are under no obligation whatsoever to correct anybody. Let both versions carry on existing. They have been managing it for 400 years. Whatever sorting out you feel like doing can be done in daylight, by a rested person, and there is no part of it that improves by being done now. It would have been raining. He died in the middle of June by our reckoning, which on that island is the wet season, when the hills go under low cloud for weeks and everything stays damp and the light never quite arrives. The cave is on a wooded slope with a stream below it, open along one side, not deep, not dry, with a stone figure set back in the rock that had been there long before he came. It is not a hermit's cell out of a painting. It is a hollow in a hillside where a man in his 60s, in pain, spent 2 years sitting on a rock floor with a brush, and where, in the spring of 1645, he finished. He gave the manuscript to a student named Terao Magonojo, one of 2 brothers who had stayed with him. 5 scrolls, the whole of what he had. And then, with a few weeks left, he began giving away everything else. There was not much. What there was, he distributed. The objects, the things a man accumulates, even when he has spent 60 years accumulating as little as possible. And on the 12th day of the 5th month, while that was going on, he sat down and wrote one more document. And it is the shortest and strangest thing he ever produced, and unlike almost everything else in this story, the actual physical object still exists. You can see it in a museum in Kumamoto, a single sheet of Japanese paper, about 17 centimeters tall and just under a meter long. 21 rules, each one written in exactly 2 lines, the spacing regular the whole way down. It is signed with his formal name and addressed, like the book, to the same student. It is called the Dokudo, Dok-ko-do, which means more or less the way of walking alone. Here is some of what is on it, in his order. Accept everything just as it is. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. Think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world. Be detached from desire your whole life long. Do not regret what you have done. Never be jealous. Never let separation sadden you. Resentment and complaint are of no use to yourself or to anyone else. Do not be guided by lust or by love. In all things have no preferences. Be indifferent to where you live. Do not pursue fine food. Do not hold on to possessions you no longer need. Do not fear death. Do not seek property or an estate for your old age. Respect the gods and the Buddhas, and do not depend on them. Never stray from the way. Now, some of those are simply true and hard, and would improve most lives if anybody could manage them. And several of them are being written by a man in direct contradiction of the circumstances he is writing in, and he does not appear to notice, and I do not think we should look away from it. He writes that a man should not seek property or an estate for his old age. He is 62 years old, living in the old age in question on a lord's stipend, with a residence in a castle assigned to him in a city he did not come from. He writes that a man should not keep possessions he does not need. He had made sword guards and a pair of folding screens and carved figures and painted more than a dozen pictures that people had thought worth keeping. He writes, "Do not regret what you have done." This is the man who looked back at 60 victories in the opening pages of his own book and concluded that they had probably been luck, natural ability, or opponents who were not much good. And then there is the 8th one, which is the one that stops me every time I read this list, and I have read it a great many times. Never let separation sadden you. Think about who is writing that sentence. A boy he adopted at 11 and raised and placed in a great household opened his own stomach at 22 because somebody else had died. The only man who ever asked him to write down what he thought was dead within about 2 months of receiving the answer. He never married. He had no children of his own that we can confirm. He had at the end 2 students, one of whom he handed his life's work to before turning to face the wall. That is either a hard-won instruction from a man who genuinely got free of it, or it is a note written by somebody who had lost a great deal and was still, at 62, 7 days from death, telling himself how to hold it. I cannot tell. I have gone at this for a long time, and I cannot tell, and I want to be honest with you rather than tidy about it. Take the 3 refusals we know about, the ones a historian used to sum him up. He never took a wife. He never cut his hair in the manner of his class. He never, apparently, went into a bath. Turn them one way and they are a discipline. He removed marriage and status display and the ordinary sociable comforts, and what he had left was an enormous amount of unencumbered time and attention, which he spent on a single problem for 50 years. And the result is a book people are still arguing about tonight, 4 centuries later, on the other side of the planet. Very few human beings get anywhere near that kind of concentration. Whole religious traditions are organized around trying, and mostly they do not manage it. Turn them the other way and they are damage, described sympathetically by its owner. A small boy whose mother died. A father who was measurably better than him at the one thing the household valued, remembered as cold. A child who killed a professional in a field before he was 14 and never afterwards belonged anywhere. Everything that follows, the not marrying, the not settling, the not attaching, the not depending, the refusal of every position offered, reads perfectly well as a man spending 5 decades constructing an argument for why the things he could not do were the things not worth doing. And the difficulty, the real difficulty, is that those 2 readings are not distinguishable from outside. I suspect they are not distinguishable from inside either. Most disciplines are a wound with a philosophy built carefully over the top of it, and most wounds that are properly attended to for long enough turn into something that looks a great deal like a discipline. It may not be 2 things at all. It may just be one thing seen in 2 lights, and the light depends on where you happen to be standing. He kept it up to the end. 7 days after he dated that sheet of paper, in the 5th month of 1645, he died. The account of it comes from one of the school's records, and it is very specific. He had himself lifted upright. He had his belt tightened and his short sword put into it. He arranged himself seated, with one knee raised vertically, the sword held in his left hand and a cane in his right. And he died in that position. Whether it happened in the cave or whether they had already carried him down to the house in the city is disputed, and the earlier of the two sources says the house. What killed him is not really known at all. A modern guess of a tumour in the chest, with no document behind it, and before that a couple of years of nerve pain. There is a tradition that he asked to be buried beside the road the Lord's processions travelled, so that he could go on saluting them, which, if it is true, is a very strange last request from a man who spent his life declining to serve anybody. Almost nothing about this life closes cleanly. Not the birth year, not the birthplace, not the battle, not the name of the man on the island, not the place of death, not the cause. He is the most famous swordsman in the history of the world, and he is mostly a set of open questions with a book attached. You are carrying a version of the same thing on a smaller scale, and there is no way to check it either. Somewhere along the way you decided that certain things were not for you. A kind of work, a kind of closeness, a place, a risk, and you have an account of why, and the account is decent. You thought it through, there were reasons. Some of them were even good, and you cannot ever find out whether it was a choice or a flinch, because there is no control version of your life running alongside this one where you did the other thing. That audit is not available. It was never available to him either, and he spent 30 years attempting it anyway, in a cave, and got to the end without an answer. So we can put it down now, and I think we should. Whatever that was, mastery or narrowing or both at once, it is finished, and it has been finished for 400 years, and the question it left is still perfectly open, and nothing about it needs to move tonight. It has been sitting there since 1645. It will sit there a while longer. You are not the person who has to settle it, and this is not the hour, and there will be plenty of daylight for the parts of it that are actually yours. Let the 60 fights go. They were mostly a young man on cold roads, a very long way from here, and the man himself did not think they proved anything. Let the boy at the pine tree go, and the stone off the wall, and the bird on the dead branch, and the 21 lines on the meter of paper. None of it is yours to hold. It has all been held already by people who are gone, and it is being held now by museums and stones and a book, and none of that requires anything from you at all. Your breathing has settled a long way down without any help from you. The room is dark and warm and holding perfectly well. Your hands are open. There is nothing to decide, nothing to remember, nothing coming, and no part of any of this that will be worse for being left exactly where it is. Rest now. Good night.